And the Central Bank of Nigeria unveiled an e-learning platform, Sabi Money, to promote financial literacy and deepen financial inclusion. Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Mr. Gordon Emefiele, says the platform is a full digital national e-learning platform that provides a knowledge base for financial literacy. According to him, Sabi Money is aimed at providing individuals with the opportunity to be trained and become certified financial literacy trainers. Through self-service, the platform is aimed at supporting the Apex Bank's efforts towards ramping up the number of experts that can be used to drive financial education in the country and perhaps beyond. Mr. Emefiele discloses that the absence of low levels of financial literacy constituted an impediment to financial inclusion. The Director of Consumer Protection of the CBN, Mrs. Rashida Mungono, says financial literacy remained a key driver of financial inclusion globally. Now, the National Bureau of Statistics says Nigeria's headline inflation rose 22.22% in April from 22.04% in March. According to Consumer Price Index report released by the NBS, the April 2023 inflation rate showed an increase of 0.18 percentage points when compared to the figures for a year before. Similarly, on a year-on-year basis, the headline inflation rate was 5.4 percentage points higher compared to the rate recorded in April 2022, which was 16.82%. Now, the surge in inflation is attributed to the persistent food shortages, food prices in the country, which have risen due to naira depreciation against the dollar and the continued ripple effects of the Russia and Ukraine war. Let's analyze this and, of course, get a clear understanding of what the new figures from the NBS means. And I'm being joined via Zoom from Lagos here, the Center of Excellence, the Chief Consultant of B. Adedipe Associates Limited, Dr. Biodun Adedipe. Dr. Adedipe, good afternoon. It's good to have you on the program.
Thank you so very much, Tolu. A very good afternoon to you and the viewers.
Yes, I know that it won't be a surprise to you that inflation at the moment is at 22.22%. But the question I would ask you very quickly before we go into more fundamentals on why we have this rise or this increase is that it seems that all of the monetary policy efforts being made by the Apex Bank seems not to be yielding any fruit. Since May 2022, we've been increasing rates to address inflation, but nothing seems to be happening along that line. Doctor, what do you think about this?
Thank you so very much. I think the basic and fundamental thing here is that we are yet to fully address the drivers of this inflation we are looking at today in Nigeria. Now, by the nature of what we are dealing with, it is cost push. And so the question will be, what are the elements, the factors that are pushing costs that is also reflecting now in the inflation rate? So a lot of what we have been doing have been in the direction of dealing with the effect and symptoms, rather than looking at the fundamentals and factors that are pushing this inflation. And so we are applying the wrong instruments and policies to tackle this without bringing into consideration the historical, up until date, causes of rise of inflation rates in Nigeria. And I use the word historical deliberately, but that is where the answer is, really.
Interesting stuff. Let's now come back to these increases, as we said. I think food is driving this so drastically at this time. And what is responsible for that? Insecurity is what we've talked about in some time. But our farmers, yes, I don't think they are going to the farm the way they used to go. What is happening around that space, Dr. Adedipe?
Yes, thank you. Now, insecurity is one big part of it, but there are a lot of other issues. Now, about 6 years ago, I raised this issue of insecurity as likely to become a big picture in our inflation in Nigeria. And it's basic common sense. And this is the way it goes. If I happen to be a farmer and there's something that happens and makes me unable to go to my farm, which is my normal vocation, that means whatever that act is a terrorism act. Okay, that's the reality of it. So once I become afraid to go to the farm, It means the normal produce from my farm, which becomes a part of the supply to the market, their market will lose it. And when that number increases, it means the volume of agricultural produce locally that goes into the market will also reduce. One that reduces, two elements come in there. The first is that you have a population that is growing, and a larger percentage of that population is also migrating to the urban areas. There's been a switch in our urbanization in Nigeria. Now, at the present moment, we have over 50% of our population in the urban areas. All right, that's between 51 and 52%. So which means a lot more of them are not involved in farming to start with. Then secondly, the more people we have in the urban area that receive what is produced in the farms, the more the challenge of having to actually supply them produce. So if you cannot produce enough to supply their need for food, it means then that you need to import. And that brings the second element into it. The more food items you now have to import, the more vulnerable you become to imported inflation. All right? So in which case, you are in this into consideration the fact that a lot of what we produce in our farms also don't get to the market because we have storage, poor storage infrastructure, which means going by the data, depending on the particular agricultural produce you're looking at, between 50 and 60% of farm output may actually go to waste. So in which case, what would have also been a part of the supply to the market is being lost because of the nature of the product, which at times we describe as is a wasting or a product you cannot preserve. So when you put all of this together, they give you what I call historical drivers of the rate of inflation. Now you come to recent policy choices and the way those policies were implemented and sequenced. Most of our policymakers forget one thing, that there's a difference between a policy being executed and now the components of that policy are sequenced. So if they are not properly sequenced, you also get an outcome completely different than what you expected. Equally, and this is important now for the policy perspective, most of the time, we don't do policy impact analysis. We also use the terminology regulatory impact analysis. We don't do them before we roll out policies. So if we do that, then we have a good idea of what the impact will likely be first level. And then the first level impact makes us to now say, okay, if this happens, what should we do to deal with the first level impact? So you're already looking ahead onto the second level impact and response by policy. But we don't do that. So we only get the first level impact and then we try our hands up in the air that the policy is not working. So now these are the challenges that keep on pushing the rate of inflation. Unfortunately, also, we look at the traditional monetary policy, and that is the rate of interest, which, of course, we make reference to as the policy rate. Yes, granted, that is the orthodox monetary policy approach to dealing with inflation anywhere in the world. So typically, central banks, reserve banks, will raise interest in the policy rate in order to send a signal to the banks. So anytime they raise it, it means banks, we are giving you a signal to also mark up your lending rate, making credit more expensive. The basic reason for that is also to slow down the economy. So you believe that if you do that, you will remove the heat as less credit is pushed out into the market. And so the opportunity, therefore, in the quest for credit to grow business and also grow the economy will slow down a little bit. So that pressure subsiding is expected to also impact the rate of inflation, but it doesn't work so in Nigeria. That's why I used the word historical earlier on. If you look at the history of our economy, and the data is available, for those who always say that oh, there's no data in Nigeria, it's not correct. The data is available, you interrogate it. All you need to do, for example, you can even make it simplistic. Do a simple, correlation analysis. Take the rate of inflation, use it then on one hand. Take also the policy rate, the CBN monetary policy rate, or what we used to call the monetary the discount rate, okay, MRR. Now, take that rate, lay it beside the rate of inflation, and check out the correlation. Second level analysis, lag inflation rate by a season. And that means if we increase rate today, what will the inflation rate be in the next month or cycle? So if you lag inflation rate, you also discover that the correlation is not in any way strong, which means monetary policy rate is not an effective tool for dealing with inflation in Nigeria. And then that brings us to what you mentioned, food inflation. That is the major driver of inflation in Nigeria. And so it means what we should be actually discussing and giving more attention to is how to entrench food security, especially the first two big issues in there, food availability and food affordability. Those are the first two elements of food security. That is what we should be paying attention to. In fact, I will say to you, Tolu, that is what the new administration should interrogate a lot more. How do we produce more? And what we produce, how do we reduce wastage so that these items get to the markets and from there to the dining tables? And then how do we ensure that they become affordable? That is a matter of the volume, which is basic economics, okay? So those are the issues when we interrogate inflation in Nigeria. And that is why also we've observed that the monetary policy rate, increase doesn't bring a respite to the rate of inflation in Nigeria.
Interesting stuff. Prices of gas, fuel, passengers and aviation, that's aircraft, all of this seems to also be fueling inflation. And some of these are beyond our control. That's when you talk about, of course, crude oil and all of this. But coming down to all of these high increases, it shows that moving on, inflation will still be on the increase. Do you see it coming down anytime soon?
Well, I have an expectation that in the second half of the year, inflation rates will likely tick down and come less than 20%. And what is my reason for this? Now, typically, if you look again at our history, once we get to the harvest season of most staple food items, staple crops in Nigeria, usually the market becomes swamped with supply and the price of those items come down. That is on the one side. Then I also believe strongly that by the time we get to the second half, don't forget we'll have a new government in place, a new administration. So I expect also that there are thinkers and the major government functionaries in charge of economic sectors would have paid attention to some of the things we are talking about here and see what they need to do so that ultimately we'll be looking at what are those things that drive inflation. So what do we do in that regard? So and don't also forget there's what I described in my own observation. In the last 2 years, there's what I will call the new manufacturing in Nigeria. New manufacturing simply means there are factories springing up along certain corridors in Nigeria, and those factories also will represent production of things that we used to import hitherto. So if we produce them locally, that means the weight of the exchange value of the naira in their final output will be limited to the portion of input that they import. So which will be quite different than the weight of the value of the naira in the fully, final product that we import. So that will bring also some respite in that regard, which case we now see ourselves producing some and indeed more of what we consume rather than importing them. So you need only to look at the import bill of Nigeria in the last 10 years. From about 514 billion naira, our average import bill monthly for 2022 was at 1.86 trillion naira. That means per month. So which means in the last 10 years, our import bill has more than tripled. So if we see this dynamics play now, we are those that used to, export their materials to Nigeria, now set up factories in here and produce them locally. That will also bring some bit of respite. And of course, what this also talks to is to look back at our history from 1966 up until date. And that is when we have been correcting the pumped price of petroleum products in Nigeria. And each time we bring the argument that, we need to remove subsidy in the pricing of petroleum products. But we have forgotten that the basic driver of the pump price of petroleum products is simply what it costs you to bring the product to the consumer at that point in time. So the question there will be, where is the product coming from? So the same thing we say about agri products and manufactured products, we say about refined petroleum products. And that the connection to aviation fuel, kerosene, diesel, PMS, that's gasoline or petrol, whichever name you call it, is the same thing that happens to them. So once we get right, that plant to begin to produce locally, we also get some respite. So when all of this come together, then we are looking at a situation where Nigeria has chances before the end of this year to see inflation rates drop. And that is my own perspective to this.
Interesting stuff. Now, almost finally, you touched on very sensitive issue there, subsidy. And I know if we start on that today, we won't have enough time to analyze that. The report today says 13 trillion naira was spent on subsidy in the past 16 years. That's the figure we have today. That is really, really a huge amount that can do other things for us as a country. But what's your take with regards to the structural aspect? Many say our problem has to do with domestic structural factors. I know you touched on some in your submission earlier, but specifically, what can be done to address some of these structural factors?
Okay, thank you very much. Now, for me, when it comes to the issue of subsidy, there are three big elements in there. Yes, the big one is that, which we all talk about, that we import basically close to 100% of the refined petroleum products that we consume. So that one is given. And the argument I've made over the decades, no longer years now, is that if you remove the so-called subsidy today in the pump price of petroleum products, and we continue to import refined petroleum products, and then the naira loses value, it means that without doing any other thing, that subsidy will creep back into your equation. So which means the pointer there is not even about the volume, it's about where it is coming from. Insofar as you are importing refined products, the issue of subsidy is inescapable. It will not be a function of who is paying for it, all right? That's on the one hand. Now, the second big element in that number of 13 trillion you mentioned is what I would call fraud, okay? Fraud this time around comes from the perspective of the fact that not every naira you see in that figure actually represents imported refined products, okay, from what we read and also hear about this matter. That means then that some elements in that figure are not actually bills paid on importation of refined products, okay? So now the third element is the fact that there is a lot of inefficiency also in the process of bringing those products in. So which means there are actually three big elements. Where the product is coming from is one, fraud is another, the third one is inefficiency. So for us to deal with it decisively, and let me also submit here that it is practically impossible to remove subsidy all at once. And I want Nigerians to understand this. If you remove the subsidy all at once, you cannot escape the inflationary pressure it will bring. You can talk about palliatives from now till tomorrow. There will still be some portion of that you will have to deal with. So the first big number is for us to produce enough refined products domestically. That's the starting point. Then the second thing is, how do we even price their feedstock? That is the crude oil we sell to them. And I've made this point for a couple of years when we're talking about the Dangote refinery and then, of course, the Bonula refineries and the rest of them. I said, until we get to a point where we recognize that whatever is being produced locally, by all means, should have an advantage over a competing product that will import. So if our tariff structure also is not designed in a way to encourage domestic production, vis-a-vis imported finished products, we still run into the same problem. We cannot sell crude at the same price to domestic refineries as we sell in the international market. Okay? So whichever name you want to call it, but people think that subsidy itself is evil. There's a place for subsidy in economic management. Today in the US, in Europe, their government subsidize the production and sale of electric vehicles. Go down the direction they want their economy to go. As we speak, they subsidize those elements. Okay? So when people say subsidy, it is about what you mentioned correctly, the structural issues in there. How do we manage it? Whom should we subsidize? Do we subsidize consumers or subsidize producers? So, and that's the big question we need to answer. So when you subsidize producers, they are also under obligation. I'm happy you mentioned earlier. We're going to talk about corporate governance, the second segment of this program today. So that means that there is a social compact. That those producers, you subsidize their production so that whatever they come out with eventually as the selling price of their product, we recognize that government are giving them support in this way because it helps us to solve a major problem with our economy. So those are the issues that are in there structurally. And of course, there must be consequence also for those who try to game the system. If you game the system by committing fraud along the value chains, there must be consequence for that, so that people don't think they can do it and get away with it. Once that is strengthened, then it means we get to a point where the element of fraud in that process is removed, and then you are subsidizing producers, not consumers, and the producers themselves have a social compact, that is an understanding and a commitment that they will not do whatever is contrary to the common good of the economy and Nigerians generally.
Interesting way to leave it. I must thank you so much for your contributions as usual. I've been speaking to Dr. Biodun Adedipe. He is the chief consultant, B. Adedipe Associates Limited. Thank you so much for your time on the show. We sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right.